Hi students, one of the themes that we find in this course is the theme of the rise of state power. We've seen this a little bit in our study of the Protestant Reformation, in how local political rulers are really crucial to enabling the Protestant Reformation to be successful. And so this week we're going to look a little bit more at political structures during this period. And we're going to look a little more at how political power was wielded and some of the theories behind political power during this time. And we're going to begin in this video by looking at the theory of absolutism. That is, the theory that essentially the king, the ruler, is above the law and isn't constrained by the rule of law. They are answerable only to God. And I think an important question to answer at the beginning is to explain why it is that this is something new in the 17th century. Isn't this always been the way? Haven't kings always been absolutely powerful? Many people's idea of a king is an absolute ruler. They equate a king with someone who can do whatever they want, order the execution of whomever they want. I think some of it perhaps comes from Star Wars and this idea of an emperor who's totally all-powerful. But actually, prior to the period that we're studying in this class, most countries had kings, most countries were ruled by kings, but there were constraints on those rulers' power. There were two important constraints. First, the other nobles, the leading warriors in the kingdom, and then also the church. So, to come to the nobles first. These are the leading warriors in the kingdom. They control much of the land of the kingdom. They have direct access to a lot of the soldiers in the kingdom. If they are allied together, they are typically stronger than the king is. So the king has to remain on good terms with the nobles. The church. Single unified church for much of the medieval period, much of the period before this course begins. If the church was unhappy with you, they could require or encourage your citizens to disobey or rebel against you. And so for these reasons, it was really important for kings prior to 1500 to have at least one of the nobles and the church on their side. And that meant that they would have to negotiate their agenda with these other power brokers. It wasn't as though they could simply impose exactly what they wanted. They had to have, ideally, the support of both the nobles and the church, but certainly the support of one. Now, this starts to change in the 15th century. Starts to change in the century leading up to the Protestant Reformation and then the century after the Protestant Reformation for a couple of reasons that I'm going to talk about now. Firstly, political society in Europe is more secure than it has ever been before. And so this means that kings no longer need to give their nobles power in kind of the more disparate geographic regions. They can kind of consolidate power themselves. Second, in the 15th century, there's a bunch of dynastic wars, really destructive civil wars. You find these wars in Spain, in France, a little bit in modern-day Germany, and also in Britain. So all these Western European countries experience civil wars. Civil wars, and why do these civil wars occur? They occur because the different local nobles are all pretty powerful, all pretty independent, all have their own armies. And so they can fight against one another, and basically they're fighting to become the king. And so there's a growing sentiment among people living in this time to say, we would rather have a more powerful king who can make these nobles stop fighting with each other than to have these ongoing civil wars. And so the support for greater centralization of power, for the king to become more powerful than the nobles, than rulers have typically been before. Secondly, so you have these dynastic wars. They weaken people's respect for the nobles and their desire that the nobles should act as a check on the ruler. Instead, they want to see the ruler dominate the nobles. Second, we have the weakening of the church that we've seen in the past couple of weeks or so. We have the religious confusion and division of the 15th century with multiple people claiming to be pope. So now there's not a unified church anymore. Multiple different people are claiming to be pope. If one set disagrees with you, if you're a ruler and one set disagrees with you, why not go to the other and say, okay, I'll support you. I think you're the pope. I think you're the pope. I'm going to accept your bishops. And then this, of course, is exacerbated by the Protestant Reformation. Now it's not that you have one church that's got three competing parties. You increasingly have more and more churches. And so the balance of power and obligation shifts. Instead of there being a sense that the king or the queen has to work with the church, or the church will condemn them, will encourage their citizens to rebel against them. Now the different churches are competing for the loyalty or for the support of the king. And so that relationship has been inverted. And so in both these instances, the cultural shift that's taken place is to want to present the king as a check on the destructive tendencies of religious hierarchies and of nobles. And so rulers are becoming more powerful. It's becoming more culturally acceptable for rulers to be more powerful. And so that's a big shift that's taking place in the 15th and the 16th centuries. And then you have the 30 Years' War, a hugely destructive, ostensibly, although from last week we know now it's not really a religious war, but at least it is presented as a religious war. And so there's an increasing desire to have powerful, centralized rulers that can put an end to all this confusion and all this violence that's stemming from the people who had previously provided a check on the power of the ruler. And we see this epitomized best in the political theory of a man called Thomas Hobbes. And in 1651, so 3 years after the 30 Years' War, and that's not a coincidence at all, 3 years after the 30 Years' War, Thomas Hobbes writes a book called Leviathan. And in this book, he proposes a new theory of politics and society. Previously, it had been accepted, and this goes back to Aristotle, maybe even to Plato. It had been accepted that human beings are naturally designed to live in community, and that human beings are most happy when they're living in community. And Hobbes calls that into question. He looks at the world around him and he says, human beings are naturally competitive. They're naturally competitive, they're naturally violent towards one another. And society, the idea that human beings will live in community together, that's something artificial. That's something artificial, and where human beings are naturally is what's called a state of nature. A state in which human beings, there's no law, there's no community, but human beings just fight with one another, fight and do battle with one another, and there's no order. And so because the state of nature is so violent, human beings have to create a society. Society is something artificial. That's the premise of, or important premise of Hobbes' argument. Society is artificial, and therefore human beings create this society because the state of nature is so violent. And because of that, they are willing to give up rights and freedoms to a sovereign. And this is who Hobbes calls Leviathan. And so Hobbes proposes that human beings need a political ruler who is all-powerful, who controls church and state, who is what by any standard we would say today is tyrannical. For Hobbes, this is necessary in order that human beings don't fight with one another. And this is the theoretical premise for absolutism. Okay, I'm going to come back with another video and talk about some examples of absolutism.